the desert holds its secrets well. Long after men have vanished, their names remain, whispered in the wind, etched in rock, and passed down in legend. Among those names is one that still lingers like a ghost in the canyons of the Southwest: the Apache Kid. A warrior, a scout, an outlaw, a fugitive hunted by armies, feared by settlers, and immortalized in folklore. His story is one of betrayal, survival, and unanswered questions. Was he truly the ruthless bandit that history remembers? Or was he a scapegoat? Another casualty of the brutal conflicts between his people and the American frontier. Born into the White Mountain Apache in the 1860s, the man who would become the Apache Kid grew up in a world at war. The U.S. Army fought to control the land, settlers pushed westward, and Apache bands resisted with everything they had. In this violent, shifting landscape, the boy learned the ways of the warrior. By the 1880s, the U.S. military was recruiting Apache men as scouts to track down their own people. The Apache Kid proved himself a natural, a skilled tracker, a deadly shot, and a trusted leader under the famous General Crook. But trust on the frontier was fragile, and a single act of vengeance would turn him from soldier to fugitive forever. This is the story of the Apache Kid, his rise, his fall, and his mysterious disappearance. A tale of the West that still refuses to be buried. Before the legend, before the manhunt, before the headlines screamed his name, there was simply a boy. Born sometime in the early 1860s, he was a child of the White Mountain Apache, a people who had called this rugged land home for centuries. He was given an Apache name, Scapegoat, but history remembers him only as the Apache Kid. He was raised in a world of warriors, where survival meant knowing the land as well as one knew their own heartbeat. He learned to track deer through the mountains, read the signs of an approaching storm, and move silently through the night. But the world around him was changing fast. The Apache Wars had raged for decades, and the U.S. Army was relentless in its pursuit to control the land and its people. By the time the Apache Kid was a young man, his people were no longer free to roam as they once had. Raids on settlements led to violent reprisals. Families were forced onto reservations. The land that had been theirs for generations was disappearing under the weight of treaties signed in bad faith and the iron will of the U.S. government. But the Army saw a use for the Apache warriors. In the 1870s and 1880s, the U.S. government began recruiting Apache men as scouts, enlisting them to track down Geronimo and others who refused to surrender. These scouts knew the land better than any soldier, and they were feared for their skill in battle. The Apache Kid was among them, rising quickly through the ranks under the command of the legendary General George Crook. Crook valued the Apache scouts, treating them with more respect than most officers, but they were still seen as tools of war, useful until they weren't. The Kid earned a reputation as a fierce warrior, known for his sharp instincts and loyalty to his fellow scouts. He was trusted, even admired. But the trust between the Apache and the U.S. Army was never meant to last. For a time, the Apache Kid served with distinction, leading patrols, hunting down outlaws, and fighting in battles that history barely remembers. But the world he fought for was shifting beneath his feet. No matter how skilled or loyal he was, the government would never see him as an equal. And in one fateful moment, all that he had built would come crashing down. In 1887, everything changed. A single act of vengeance would turn the Apache Kid from a soldier into a hunted man. What followed was a betrayal so deep it would drive him into the wilderness, into legend. The story of his downfall is one of justice denied, promises broken, and the harsh reality of life on the frontier. The year was 1887, and the Apache Kid was at the height of his career. A respected scout, a trusted leader, he had done everything the U.S. Army had asked of him. But trust was a fragile thing on the frontier, and in a single moment, it shattered. Among the Apache scouts, loyalty to one another was sacred. They had fought together, bled together, and in a land where few could be trusted, they relied on each other above all else. But when news came that one of their own had been murdered, that bond would be tested in ways they never expected. The details of what happened next remain unclear, lost in the haze of conflicting reports and government records. But what is certain is this: one of the Kid's fellow scouts, an Apache named Rip, was found dead. Apache law demanded justice. So did the Kid. The scouts believed they knew the murderer, another Apache named Togo de Choose, a man with a reputation for violence. In the world of the Apache, such betrayals could not go unanswered. The Kid and several others took matters into their own hands, tracking down the accused and delivering what they saw as justice, a swift execution in the heart of the wilderness. But the world the Apache lived in was no longer ruled by their laws. The army, their supposed allies, saw the killing not as justice, but as murder. Arrested and thrown before a military tribunal, the Kid and his fellow scouts found themselves at the mercy of a system that had never truly been on their side. The trial was swift. The verdict? Death. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Apache Kid's story would end here, at the end of a noose. But fate intervened. Whether it was the protests of his commanding officers or the fear of further unrest among the Apache, the sentence was reduced. Instead of execution, the Kid and his men were to serve 10 years of hard labor in the infamous prison at Alcatraz. The Apache Kid, once a trusted scout, was now a convicted criminal. But even as he faced a decade behind bars, his story was far from over. Because in the vast, untamed lands of the Arizona Territory, some men refused to be caged. Before he could be sent to Alcatraz, the Kid was transported to Arizona for further hearings. And it was there, on the road to prison, that he made his move. October 1889. A prisoner transport, a moment of confusion. And just like that, the Apache Kid was gone. The man who had once been a soldier of the U.S. Army had now become its most wanted fugitive. But escaping into the wilderness was only the beginning. In the days that followed, reports flooded in from across the Arizona Territory. Some claimed to have seen the Kid riding hard toward the Mexican border, a rifle slung across his back. Others swore he was hiding among the Apache strongholds in the Sierra Madre, protected by those who still saw him as a hero. But the truth? That was harder to find. The U.S. Army wasted no time. Scouts, bounty hunters, and soldiers were all sent in pursuit. Forts from Tucson to Fort Apache were put on high alert. Yet for all their efforts, the Kid remained a ghost. The bounty on his head was enormous. $5,000, a fortune for any man who could bring him in. And yet, no one did. Months turned into years, and the Apache Kid became less of a man and more of a legend. Stories spread like wildfire. Settlers spoke in hushed tones of raids on remote ranches. Stock stolen, men left dead. Stagecoaches attacked by unseen gunmen. Was it the Kid? Or was he merely a convenient villain, blamed for every crime that couldn't be solved? For the U.S. military, it didn't matter. The Apache Kid was still out there, and as long as he lived, he was a threat. Year after year, they sent men into the mountains to track him down. Year after year, they came back empty-handed. Even across the border, the hunt continued. The Mexican rurales, elite mounted police, were ordered to find him. The Sierra Madre was a lawless land, but if anyone could tame it, They could, or so they thought. For more than a decade after his escape, the Apache Kid remained a phantom. His name was spoken in fear by settlers, in anger by lawmen, and in reverence by those who still saw him as a warrior, not an outlaw. But as time passed, even his legend began to fade. Reports of his death surfaced repeatedly. Some claimed he was shot down in a skirmish with the Mexican rurales in Sonora. Others swore he was ambushed by bounty hunters somewhere near the Arizona border. But no one ever produced a body. No grave was ever marked. And for every rumor of his death, another sighting would emerge. A lone figure spotted near an abandoned ranch. A shadow moving through the mountains. Ranchers spoke of stolen cattle, of arrows appearing in fence posts like silent warnings. Was it the kid? Or had his legend grown larger than the man himself? By the early 1900s, the Old West was vanishing. The frontier had been tamed, railroads and telegraphs binding the land that once seemed endless. The Apache Wars were over, their warriors either defeated, scattered, or assimilated into reservation life. But one question remained. What had become of the Apache Kid? In the years that followed, stories trickled down from the Sierra Madre. Some claimed he lived among the mountain tribes, never revealing his true name. Others believed he died an old man, buried in a place only the Apache knew. And perhaps that was how he wanted it. No official record of his death was ever made. No remains were ever identified. The U.S. government stopped looking, but the legend never stopped growing. The Apache Kid was more than an outlaw. He had become a ghost of the frontier, a reminder of a time when the West was still wild and free. Did he meet his end in a hail of gunfire? Or did he live long enough to watch the world change around him? The answer is buried in the land he once called home, in the canyons where the wind still carries his name. The Apache Kid, outlaw, warrior, or something more. In the end, the truth is as untamed as the man himself. More than a century has passed since the Apache Kid vanished into the wilderness. But his name has never been forgotten. He remains one of the most elusive figures in the history of the American West. Part warrior, part outlaw, part ghost. History branded him as a ruthless fugitive, a killer who defied the law and evaded capture at every turn. But was that the truth? Or was he simply a man caught between two worlds, used by the U.S. Army when he was needed, discarded when he no longer served their purpose? He was a trusted soldier, a warrior who fought alongside the very men who would later betray him. The same government that enlisted him as a scout turned on him the moment he sought justice in his own way. He was sentenced not for crimes of greed or power, but for following the code of his people: loyalty, honor, and vengeance. The Kid's story is not just one of crime and escape. It is a story of survival in a world that had no place for him. The Apache people, once free to roam the land, were forced onto reservations, their way of life erased. The Kid chose another path, vanishing into the wild rather than accepting a fate of confinement and submission. To this day, the mountains and deserts where he once rode remain untouched, silent witnesses to his story. Those who live in the region still tell tales of his ghost, riding under the moon, forever out of reach. Legends have a way of outlasting the truth. Some say he was a cold-blooded murderer, a menace who deserved his fate. Others argue he was a man wronged, an outlaw, not by choice, but by necessity. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. The Apache Kid is a reminder of the untamed West, a time when justice was often nothing more than who held the power. His story is unfinished, his fate unknown, his legend eternal, Perhaps he died in battle. Perhaps he lived out his days in secrecy. Or perhaps, just maybe, the Apache Kid still rides, watching from the hills, a ghost of the frontier that refused to be tamed. At American Outlaw Tube, we would love to know what you think. Was the Apache Kid an outlaw or a man betrayed? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. Like and subscribe and help this channel grow. Thank you for watching.